February 25, 1991. Sergeant First Class Anthony Seeger is manning a forward observation post near the Kuwait-Iraq border. Through his binoculars, he sees something bizarre. Iraqi soldiers are walking toward his position with their hands up. Not a few dozens of them, then hundreds. They're surrendering en masse and the ground war has barely started. Seeger gets on the radio. We've got a problem here. We've got more prisoners than we have people to guard them. Send help. A lot of help. Welcome back to Gulf War Chronicles. Today we're talking about one of the most unexpected aspects of Desert Storm, the massive Iraqi surrender. By the time the ceasefire was called on February 28th, coalition forces had captured 86,000 Iraqi prisoners of war. 86,000. The coalition didn't have plans to deal with that many. The logistics were a nightmare. And the reasons why so many Iraqis surrendered tell us a lot about what the war was really like from their perspective. This is the story nobody talks about. What happened to the Iraqi soldiers who gave up? Let me give you some context. Before the war, military planners estimated that if Iraq fought hard, coalition casualties could be in the tens of thousands. There was real concern that even with superior technology, urban warfare in Kuwait City or assaults on fortified positions could be bloody. The assumption was that Iraqi forces, especially the Republican Guard, would fight to the last man. That's what the propaganda said. That's what Saddam promised. That didn't happen. Instead, Iraqi conscript units started surrendering almost as soon as the ground war began. Some units surrendered before coalition forces even reached them. There are documented cases of Iraqi soldiers walking for miles across the desert to find coalition troops to surrender to. One Marine unit reported that Iraqi soldiers were using the surrender leaflets that coalition aircraft had dropped, holding them up like white flags, and walking toward American positions in groups of 20, 30, sometimes 100 or more. Why? The air campaign had absolutely destroyed Iraqi morale. These conscripts had been sitting in trenches and bunkers for months, getting bombed day and night. They couldn't move without being spotted by aircraft. They couldn't resupply. Food was scarce. Water was limited. Their officers were either hiding or had already fled. Many of these soldiers were Shiites from southern Iraq who'd been forced into Saddam's army and didn't want to fight anyway. When coalition ground forces showed up, surrendering seemed like the best option for survival. Lieutenant Colonel Michael Kendall was commanding a battalion in the 1st Infantry Division during the ground war. He described the surreal experience of taking prisoners. We'd breach an Iraqi defensive line, expecting a fight, and instead we'd find bunkers full of soldiers wanting to surrender. We didn't have enough MPs to process them. We'd point them south and tell them to walk toward the rear. Sometimes we'd just leave them with 1 or 2 guards, and continue the advance because we had to keep moving. The coalition had psychological operations teams dropping millions of leaflets over Iraqi positions before the ground war. These leaflets were incredibly effective. They'd show pictures of well-fed prisoners, explain how to surrender safely, promise good treatment. The leaflets had instructions in Arabic: cease resistance, be the first to surrender, you will be safe. And they worked better than anyone expected. One particularly effective leaflet showed a before and after comparison. Before showed an Iraqi soldier being bombed by coalition aircraft. After showed the same soldier as a prisoner, eating a meal safe. The message was clear: keep fighting and die, or surrender and live. For soldiers who'd been under air attack for 39 days before the ground war even started, it was an easy choice. Captain Richard Swain was an intelligence officer who interviewed Iraqi prisoners. He said the psychological impact of the air campaign can't be overstated. These guys would tell us they couldn't sleep because the bombing never stopped. They couldn't eat because supply lines were cut. They couldn't communicate because their radios didn't work. Their officers had abandoned them. When we showed up, they were relieved. Surrendering meant they'd survived. But not all surrenders were smooth. There were cases where Iraqi officers tried to force their men to keep fighting. In a few instances, Iraqi soldiers shot their own officers who were trying to stop them from surrendering. There were also cases where Iraqi units would pretend to surrender, then open fire when coalition forces got close. This happened several times and made coalition troops understandably cautious about accepting surrenders. Specialist David Cooper was in the 3rd Armored Cavalry Regiment when his unit took fire from Iraqis who'd appeared to be surrendering. "We saw white flags, we held our fire, then they started shooting. After that, we were a lot more careful. We'd make them walk to us one at a time, hands on their heads. We weren't going to get ambushed again." This violation of surrender protocols by some Iraqi units made life harder for the ones who genuinely wanted to give up. The sheer number of prisoners created massive logistical problems. The coalition hadn't built enough POW camps. They hadn't stockpiled enough food and water for tens of thousands of prisoners. They didn't have enough military police to guard them. They didn't have enough transportation to move them. In the first few days of the ground war, the POW problem threatened to slow down the entire advance. Sergeant Major Robert Clemens was assigned to help establish prisoner collection points. He described the chaos. "We'd set up a wire enclosure, and within hours we'd have thousands of prisoners. We didn't have enough guards, so we'd just tell them to stay put. And they did. They were so happy to be out of the war that they weren't trying to escape. We'd distribute MREs and water, and they'd wait to be processed." The conditions in these temporary prisoner camps were rough. Barbed wire enclosures in the desert, minimal shelter, basic rations. But compared to what these soldiers had been experiencing in their bunkers under constant air attack, it was an improvement. Red Cross representatives who inspected the camps reported that most prisoners were grateful for food, water, and safety, even if conditions weren't ideal. One of the more unusual aspects was that some Iraqi units surrendered to journalists. There's a famous incident where a BBC television crew was filming near the front lines when a group of Iraqi soldiers approached them wanting to surrender. The journalists had to call for coalition troops to come take custody of the prisoners. Another group of Iraqis tried to surrender to an Italian film crew. The war had become so one-sided that Iraqi soldiers were surrendering to anyone who looked like they might be associated with the coalition. There's even a story, possibly apocryphal but widely told, of Iraqi soldiers trying to surrender to an unmanned Pioneer drone. The drone was flying over Iraqi positions for reconnaissance, and soldiers on the ground were waving white flags at it. The drone operators back at base had to direct ground forces to the location to accept the surrender. Whether that story is exactly true or not, it captures the desperation and eagerness to surrender that many Iraqi conscripts felt. The Republican Guard was different. These units didn't surrender en masse like the conscript divisions. When Republican Guard units were engaged, they fought, not effectively, but they fought. At 73 Easting at Medina Ridge at Norfolk, Republican Guard units took casualties and inflicted some damage before being destroyed. They were better trained, better equipped, and more loyal to Saddam. But even among the Republican Guard, once it became clear the war was lost, many soldiers abandoned their equipment and fled rather than fight to the death. Major General Paul Funk commanded the 3rd Armored Division and dealt with thousands of prisoners during the advance. He made a decision that was controversial but practical. His division couldn't slow down to process prisoners, so they'd disarm them, point them toward the rear, and keep moving. We had a war to win. We couldn't become prison guards, so we'd take their weapons, give them water if we had extra, and tell them to walk south. Most of them did exactly that. They wanted out of the war. The mass surrender had strategic implications beyond just taking soldiers off the battlefield. Iraqi units that surrendered provided intelligence. They'd tell interrogators where minefields were, where other units were positioned, what the morale was like, what their orders had been. This intelligence helped coalition forces avoid casualties and plan attacks more effectively. Some prisoners gave up information willingly. Others had to be interrogated more formally, but the information flow was valuable. Captain Sarah Miller was a military intelligence officer who interrogated high-value prisoners. She said the picture that emerged was grim for Iraq. Officers would tell us their units had lost 50, 60, 70% of their strength to desertion before the ground war even started. Soldiers who hadn't deserted were half-starved and demoralized. The command structure had collapsed. It was clear that Iraq's military was a shell by the time we crossed the border. One Iraqi brigade commander who was captured said something that stuck with his interrogators. When asked why his unit had fallen apart so quickly, he said, "You bombed us for 39 days. We had no air force, no way to stop you. Then your tanks came and we couldn't see them in the dark, but they could see us. What were we supposed to do? Die for nothing?" It was a pragmatic assessment of a hopeless situation. The treatment of Iraqi prisoners became a propaganda point during the war. Coalition forces generally followed Geneva Convention rules. Prisoners got food, water, medical care. They weren't tortured or executed. CNN and other media outlets showed footage of prisoners being processed humanely. This was deliberate. It encouraged more surrenders and showed the world that the coalition was fighting a clean war. But there were incidents. Some prisoners alleged they'd been mistreated by guards. There were reports of prisoners dying in custody, though numbers were small and many deaths were attributed to wounds they'd received before capture. Human Rights Watch investigated after the war and found most allegations couldn't be substantiated, but they did note that temporary camps in the early days had poor conditions simply because the coalition wasn't prepared for that many prisoners. The contrast with how Iraq treated coalition prisoners was stark. The most famous coalition POW was Navy Lieutenant Devin Jones, an FA-18 pilot shot down on the first day of the war. He was paraded on Iraqi television, beaten, interrogated. When he was released after the war, he had visible injuries. Other coalition POWs reported similar treatment. Some were beaten, some were threatened with execution, all were used for propaganda. The difference in treatment showed the different approaches to the war. By the time the ceasefire was signed, the coalition had 86,743 Iraqi prisoners in custody. That's the official count, though some estimates go higher. To put that in perspective, that's more POWs than the United States captured in the entire Vietnam War. It's more than were captured in Korea. It happened in 43 days. The logistics of managing that many prisoners was unprecedented in modern warfare. The Saudis built massive prisoner camps in the desert to house them. These camps had tents, medical facilities, feeding stations, even recreation areas. The Red Cross had representatives monitoring conditions. Prisoners were organized by unit and rank to maintain some structure. Iraqi officers were separated from enlisted men to prevent them from maintaining military discipline within the camps. The whole operation was a massive undertaking. Repatriation started almost immediately after the war ended. The coalition didn't want to hold tens of thousands of prisoners indefinitely. By mid-March 1991, prisoners were being transported back to Iraq by the thousands. Buses would take them to the border, they'd cross into Iraq, and that was it. They were home. Most were probably relieved. Some were probably worried about what Saddam's regime would do to soldiers who'd surrendered. Staff Sergeant Mike Torres was part of the prisoner repatriation operation. He said watching the prisoners leave was bittersweet. These were mostly young guys, teenagers and guys in their 20s, who'd been conscripted and didn't want to fight. They were going home to a country that had just lost a war, where the economy was destroyed, where Saddam was still in power. You wondered what kind of life they were going back to. There were legitimate concerns about what would happen to returned POWs. Saddam's regime wasn't known for mercy. There were reports, never fully verified, that some returning prisoners were interrogated by Iraqi intelligence and that soldiers who'd surrendered too easily were punished. But the scale of the surrenders probably made it impossible for the regime to punish everyone. Tens of thousands of soldiers had given up. You can't execute that many people without causing serious internal problems. The Iraqi prisoners also provided a window into what the war had been like from their perspective. Interviews with prisoners painted a picture of an army that was never prepared for the coalition's technological advantages. They'd been told they could win, that their defenses were impregnable, that coalition forces would suffer massive casualties. Instead, they'd been bombed continuously, their supply lines cut, their positions destroyed, and when the ground war came, they'd been overwhelmed in hours. One prisoner told interrogators about watching an A-10 Warthog attack his unit's position. He said the sound of the 30mm gun was so terrifying that soldiers would abandon their vehicles and run before the aircraft even fired. Another prisoner described the effect of artillery with DPICM submunitions, thousands of small bomblets falling on their positions, impossible to escape. These weren't cowards, they were soldiers in an impossible situation. The mass surrenders also revealed something about Saddam's regime. These soldiers weren't fighting for Iraq, they were fighting because they'd been forced to. Most were Shiites or Kurds who had no loyalty to Saddam. Some were professionals who knew the war was unwinnable and surrendered to avoid pointless death. The fact that so many gave up so quickly showed that the Iraqi military wasn't the formidable force that pre-war estimates had suggested. For coalition troops, dealing with prisoners was often frustrating. You're trained to fight, you're geared up for combat, and instead you're processing hundreds of prisoners who want food and water and medical care. But most coalition soldiers treated prisoners humanely. There's a famous photo of a Marine giving water to an injured Iraqi prisoner. That image, repeated thousands of times across the battlefield, showed that coalition forces were winning not just militarily, but morally. The POW operation also had to deal with wounded prisoners. Thousands of Iraqi soldiers had been injured in the air campaign or ground fighting and needed medical care. Coalition medical units treated enemy wounded alongside their own casualties. Field hospitals that had prepared for coalition casualties instead found themselves treating mostly Iraqi prisoners. Captain Jennifer Walsh, an Army nurse, said treating enemy wounded was strange at first. But they were just guys who'd been hurt in a war they didn't start. We treated them the same as we'd treat our own. The final statistic that's worth noting, of the 86,000 Iraqi prisoners taken, the vast majority were captured in the first 3 days of the ground war. After that, the numbers dropped off significantly. Why? Because word had spread. Iraqi units knew that surrendering was safe, that they'd be fed and treated well, and that they'd probably go home after the war. So they surrendered early rather than waiting to be overrun and potentially killed. Compare that to the coalition POW situation. 23 coalition personnel were captured during Desert Storm. 21 of them were mistreated to varying degrees. All were released after the war, but the contrast was clear. The coalition took nearly 90,000 prisoners and generally treated them well. Iraq took 23 and treated many of them poorly. That difference says something important about the two sides. The legacy of the mass Iraqi surrender is complicated. On one hand, it showed that the coalition's combination of military power and psychological operations was devastatingly effective. On the other hand, it raised questions about whether the war needed to be fought at all if Iraqi forces were that unwilling to fight. Some critics said the quick collapse proved Iraq was never the threat it was portrayed to be. For the Iraqi soldiers who surrendered, most probably look back on that decision as the right one. They survived. They went home. Many of them lived through the next decade of sanctions, the insurgency after 2003, the rise of ISIS surrendering in 1991 probably seemed like the easy decision compared to what came later. For coalition forces, the prisoner operation was a logistical headache but also a measure of success. If you're taking that many prisoners, it means you're winning decisively. It means enemy forces don't want to fight you. It means your military superiority is so overwhelming that the other side has given up. 86,000 prisoners in 43 days, that's not just a military victory, that's a collapse. If you were involved in the POW operations during Desert Storm, either as a guard, an interrogator, or if you were processing prisoners at collection points, leave a comment below. This is one of those aspects of the war that doesn't get much attention, but it was a massive undertaking that involved thousands of coalition personnel. Thanks for watching Gulf War Chronicles. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button. We're telling the complete story of Desert Storm, including the parts that don't usually make the highlight reels. I'll see you in the next one.